There is security in obscurity, and that's going to be relevant to almost every single one of these tips. Now, when it comes to secure comms, I need you to understand that there's basically two things that we're trying to do, is prevent other people from being able to listen in on our transmission, and the other one is to secure our location, right? You can't fight if you can't talk, but talking isn't fighting. Affordable and reliable communications plan is pretty easy to accomplish, but add in the variables or desire to have one that is secure and legal, and now we have a few extra boundaries that we need to try to get through. And that's what this particular video is all about, giving you about 10 principles to put into your kit bag in order for you to be able to go out and try to do just that. Definitely leave some comments down below, especially if you're a ham or you got some good knowledge in the area. And if you don't, look down in the comments to see what we're all talking about down here as far as some additional tips or tricks that you can put in to your kit bag. Now, when it comes to secure comms, I need you to understand that there's basically two things that we're trying to do in this. One is prevent other people from being able to listen in on our transmission or understand what is being transmitted, and the other one is to secure our location, right? To keep our location secure. So these are the two things that we're trying to do: not disclose our location and not disclose our message, okay? And we can do this legally, right? And there are illegal ways to do that, and we'll talk about some of those later down in this video. But there are some challenges and opportunities, and again, we'll have about 10 things that we're going to discuss. And I have a few screenshots, but I'm going to try to stay away from those as much as I can. The first tip is to use the lowest power setting that you can in order to be able to get the job done. Now, for example, if I'm just trying to talk to people in my community, in my town here, which is this pretty small town where I'm at, and then a simple 5-watt is going to do more than enough to be able to get that job done. If I need to talk throughout the county, then I probably need a 25-watt radio, whether it's mobile in a vehicle or in a base station, or I need to be able to use repeaters, which we're going to talk about later. If I want to get out beyond that, if I want to talk to the other side of the country or even the other side of the world, now I need to be paying extremely close attention to what band that I'm operating off of, as well as my entire setup. And there are some crazy transmitters and antennas that are out there. They're going to be able to do that. So why do I want to use the lowest power setting? If I am operating off of a 20-meter band radio, but I'm only trying to talk to somebody in my small community, and I'm pushing out, let's just say 50 watts. I am literally asking everybody throughout my state, if not beyond, to listen in on my conversation. So one of the first things that we need to understand, and there's two like overarching messages here. One, there is security in obscurity, and that's going to be relevant to almost every single one of these tips. You probably don't advocate an open carry compared to a concealed carry, because you don't want anybody else to know your business. Well, it's the same thing when it comes to our telecommunications. I don't want everybody to know my business, so I'm not going to advertise it. When you use high wattage radios, you're advertising your message, right? So use the lowest wattage that you need to in order to be able to get the job done. That other overarching principle here is that you can't fight if you can't talk, but talking isn't fighting, right? Except for some people. We all know who they are, Bud Light drinking guys out there. Second tip is to use the shortest transmission that you need to. So, when I push to talk, I don't want to just sit here and talk out my entire message and just keep talking and keep talking and keep talking and never release. I want to use 3 to 5 second transmission bursts, if you will, in order to break up my message, but also basically to put some natural pauses in my message, but also to ensure that somebody else out there is less likely to intercept my transmission at all in the first place, okay? The next one after that is I want to avoid using military jargon. So I don't want to get on the radio and say something like, "Hey HQ, this is Spartan 7 break. I'm getting ready to SP at 0600 break. Yeah, I'm gonna go set up my LPOP at my just past my ORP, and I'll call back in at 1700 Zulu. How copy? Over." Right? I'm telling somebody not only what I'm doing in the free and clear, but they can obviously tell that I have a military background just based off of the language that I'm using. And that's something that you need to avoid. Again, obscurity, man. You don't need to advertise who you are just as much you don't need to advertise what you're talking about. So the next one I think is huge, and I think it's a little underrated, and it can require either two radios, like maybe I have a MERS and a GMRS radio, or maybe I have a typical Baofeng radio and a GMRS radio. I can do it with just this one as well, but let's say, because it's easier to understand if I have two radios, I'm going to transmit off of my Baofeng in the UHF spectrum, right? But I'm going to receive on my GMRS radio. Now, it would literally require somebody operating two different radios to pick up the entire message that is being transmitted. What's the odds of that happening? Pretty slim to nil. Most folks who are out there who are using GMRS radios, which are extremely popular, we'll break down these freaks here in a second, are not also operating a Baofeng radio, and vice versa, right? And that's why I wouldn't want to just transmit and receive on UHF and VHF, right? I would want to use two completely separate radios. That said, you can find radios that operate outside of the most common bands, right? You can get a tri-band, or you can get some more expensive radios that or harder to find radios that operate in bands that are not popular. So you could do that as well. So I want to use two different bands for transmitting. So what are the bands that are out there, and how is this whole spectrum of frequencies kind of allocated? So the radio spectrum ranges from 1 hertz to 3,000 gigahertz. Electromagnetic waves in this frequency are called radio waves and are labeled literally by how tall that wave is. The range is basically broken down into 8 bands, and the lower frequency displays a lower signal attenuation. And what we're talking about here is the reduction of force or amplitude, making them better for long distance. They can be bent, if you will, by the ionosphere in order to enable over-the-horizon communications. Higher frequencies require shorter antennas for decent reception quality. They have more energy than a lower frequency with the same amplitude. And higher freaks have a greater bandwidth for higher data rates and can easily penetrate the ionosphere. And so you can look at the spectrum that's out there, starting from basically the 23 meter band, going all the way down through your HF, and all of the options that are out there, and what is required as far as licensing, and what is most popular and least popular. You need to understand which band you should use and why. In general, you have the option of using UHF, and within UHF you have 3 primary bands as well as FRS and GMRS. The 70 centimeter band is the most popular in the UHF, and there are a ton of repeaters. FRS is what your typical walkie-talkie from Walmart is going to use and doesn't require a license at all. They're efficient for short range, but they are unsecure. GMRS requires a license, but you can also set up repeaters. And then you move into VHF, and within here you have 3 primary bands as well, but you also have MERS, which is very similar to FRS. In the VHF, the 2 meter band is very, very popular because it's very efficient. And most of your local EMS, first responders, and schools will be found here or back down in the 440. And then you have HF, which includes your citizens band, and then you have MF and LF. And the most popular in here is the 20 meter. You can check out what's popular in your area and maybe opt to use bands that nobody is using, like maybe the 10 meter in the HF, or the 222 in VHF, or 23 in UHF. And of course there are other options out there, but you can also consider our next tip, and that is to use single sideband or digital. So take a CB that's out there, right? You can go to any box store and buy a CB, and maybe you only spent 20 bucks on this thing. But if I'm using let's say a $150 CB radio and it operates off a single sideband, then that other cheap radio is never going to pick up what the hell I'm putting down. Same with using digital comms. Most popular is probably DMR and D-Star, but there are a lot of other options that are out there. These are using the same freaks, right? I could have two radios operating on the same band, on the same freak, but because one is digital, the other one at most is just going to hear digital noise and some static that's coming through. And so they may know that something is being transmitted, but they will never know what is being transmitted, if that makes sense, right? You have to have the same digital equipment on both sides in order to be able to pick up what's being put down. And that's why single sideband, even with HF radio, is a super easy way to make your comms a little bit more secure, because most people are not operating both at the same time. In addition to using multiple bands at the same time, I can change my freaks. I can have a comms plan in order to establish a comms window for what time we're going to use what freaks, right? I could say in the morning, or even just as simple as on odd days or even days. You come up with your own plan that makes sense to you and to your community or group. But that is a easy way in order to be able to keep folks from, at least it doesn't make it more secure, but it makes you far less predictable, right? And if I can't know what to predict, then it's going to make it harder on me, especially if I don't have fancy equipment. Not that it takes fancy equipment, we'll talk about that as well later, but it's just going to make it a little bit more of a challenge, right? And when it comes to the bands that are out there, again, you know, some of them are very popular and some of them are not. So radio is super popular because, you know, you can pick them up super cheap at Walmart or any big box store, let alone online. And free and clear, super popular, low distances as far as their effectiveness on FRS anyways. On GMRS you can set up a repeater in order to be able to extend your range. But that said, depending on what I'm trying to communicate, I may not want to use an FRS or GMRS radio. I may not want to use a MERS radio either, because FRS and MERS, neither one requires a license. Everything else requires some kind of license. GMRS license is a little bit different than amateur license. Same note, I can use a directional antenna or the terrain, and or the terrain. So here, let's say I have a distant end that I'm trying to push some traffic to, and I can use a directional antenna. So these are all omnidirectional antennas, right? Every single antenna that you're going to buy that comes with your, especially handheld radios, these are all omnidirectional. They're pushing the same wattage in every direction. If I'm pointing this direction, as an example, this distant end is never going to hear what I'm pushing out. But if I orient my directional antenna towards my distant end, now they can pick up, and you couldn't, right? So whether you were trying to jam this frequency, you wouldn't even know that there's something operating off of this frequency to jam, right? Or if you're trying to intercept these messages, you're never going to be able to intercept it because it's not coming to you. It's coming this way, not this way, right? Does that make sense? So in the same vein, I can use the terrain around me in order to be able to channel, if you will, my transmission. So if I'm sitting in a valley and it's coming down, or it doesn't have to be down, it can be down this way, and I have a hill here and a hill here, that is going to naturally channel my transmission down the line. Same thing with old truckers, right? We used to put dual antennas on our trucks and even pickup trucks. up on top of our headache rack, and I had these dual antennas. I'm basically making a directional antenna that has a lobe that is farther to the front than it is out to the sides, right? If that makes sense. So I can use this in order to help keep people that are on the outside of that valley, if you will, in order to be able to understand what is being transmitted. So the next tip is don't operate as much as you can from a base station. So your fixed house base station is going to be super easy to pick up on because it's in a fixed location. I need to be able to, as much as I can, operate on the move, because if this vehicle or even dismounted patrol is moving around and somebody's listening to what's happening in the area, I may be able to pick it up once, but as soon as I move, then I can't triangulate the location, right? Does that make sense? So that doesn't necessarily, again, make your message secure, but it makes your location secure. So how is somebody be able to listen into your comms in the first place? So the first thing that is required is a radio that can pick up the same frequencies. So for example, if I have two guys that are out there and they're operating off of Baofeng radios, all I have to do is hit the scan function off a radio, and I can pick up, so long as something is being transmitted at the exact same time as I'm scanning, I can pick up that transmission. If there's no transmission happening, aka use short transmissions, then a scanner is not going to do you any good. So I can pick up that something is happening on this particular frequency. If I have a directional antenna, it's going to make it much easier to figure out the location, because it's not picking it up, slightly picking it up, a little bit stronger. Oh, that's the strongest right there. Now I at least have a straight line for where this distant end is. And again, I have to be within the range for what this radio is putting out. So if this radio is only putting out 5 watts, but this receiver is 30 miles away, there's no chance it can pick it up, right? So I'm within range. I'm operating using a same radio that can pick up the same freak. It does not, when I say same radio, it doesn't mean same model. Just I'm using a radio that can pick up the same frequency. I can determine a location. Now if I move and this one doesn't move, I can move to a different location. Now I can triangulate where the location is of this radio, and that's why a mobile station, in my opinion, is better than a base station. You can't always get around that. So you can operate comms windows and some other TTPs that are out there in order to be able to obscure your location, as well as using repeaters. That's the next thing here. Using repeaters. So if I have a radio, let's say it's a GMRS radio, and I'm pushing out, let's just say 3 watts, and it's not far enough to get to a town away from me, which it would not be, but if there's a repeater out there that I can get into, and or I put my own repeater in between myself and the distant end, now I can actually do this for a couple reasons. One, it extends my range, but more importantly than that, when it comes to security, is if there is a receiver out there trying to listen into comms, it's outside of my range, it may be able to pick up what's happening on that repeater, but it will never be able to basically do a packet trace to figure out my location, right? Does that make sense? Another small quick side note, so FCC, right? That's the entity that everybody's worried about. But what you need to understand is the FCC is not out there listening for you, at least not intentionally, right? So do they have listening stations? Yes. And do other entities, 3-letter agencies, have listening stations? Yes. But they are not listening to listen to what you're transmitting. If you have a Baofeng and you're not operating off of a license, like the FCC ultimately doesn't care until that ham who's out there figures out that you don't have a license, and then they start dedicating their time to figure out your location because you're operating in a base station, and now they report you to the FCC and now you get a fine. For the most part, that's how that works. Just like with drone operators, it's not the FCC who's picking up what you're doing. It's that other drone operator with a license who's working for that realtor, and because you're trying to do some cash under the table stuff, they find out and they report you, and that's how you kind of get in trouble. Next up, privacy codes. A lot of your MERS, FRS, and GMRS radios, they're going to put out privacy codes, and what I need you to understand is they are private, in as much as hanging a do not disturb sign on the outside of your cheap $25 motel room is private, right? It's going to keep it's going to keep that maid from coming into your room, right? But if they're right outside your room, they can hear exactly all that raunchy sex that you're trying to have in that cheap motel, right? Does that make sense? Apologies. No apologies. So don't use them, because everybody else can still hear what you're saying. Next up is rolling codes and voice scramblers. So on this note, there are plenty out there that are probably not legal, but as a general rule of thumb, if you can buy equipment from a major retailer, the odds of that piece of equipment not meeting FCC requirements is slim to nil. So you can find some voice scramblers that are out there for some radios, and all we're talking about basically is another piece of hardware that's going to go into a radio. And so now both sides, just like if I'm operating again on single sideband, both sides would have to have that, right? There's some other ways to do some inversion of the frequency itself and or the volume to help obscure your message. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that what you're saying can't be decoded. It can be. It just requires the knowledge and the equipment and the experience to be able to do it. Anything else other than these major things that we've been talking about, you're probably on the edge of or beyond the edge of what is currently legal in the United States by the FCC. So for example, if I wanted to operate off the 4-meter band and I'm in England, as I understand it, there's a lot of 4-meter action that's happening. When I say a lot, that's relative, right? There is 4-meter action. In the United States, I don't think that the 4-meter band is authorized for use. However, you can buy a 4-meter band radio on Amazon, right? Or other retailers that are out there. Now, who's listening to that 4-meter? It ain't your buddy down the street. I can promise you that. And anything else, again, when it comes to things like encryption, the FCC uses loose language in its regulatory guidance. So if you are changing your transmission path in order to obscure somebody else from hearing what you're saying or understanding what you're saying, then what you're doing is probably not legal, right? If you're trying to obscure your message. And that's where things like, DMR, you're obscuring your message, right? D-Star and some of the other methods out there to use digital means in order to change your transmission, which really digital is great because it provides much clearer communications. And nobody, you geek off the streets not using digital radios, they're using analog radios. But some of these back in the day, and particularly like D-Star, is certainly on the verge of being understood as legal or illegal. But for the most part, the other digital methods that are out there it's open source knowledge. So any geek off the street can figure it out and install what is needed and operate what's needed on that particular bandwidth or that frequency in order to pick up and understand what this distant end out there is saying. In the same way that I can encode my messages. Now, on that note, there are some encoding methods, voice encoding methods that are old as Cain and Abel, if you will, and it's using our 10 codes, right? Everybody knows 10, 9, 10, 1, 10, 4, 10, 4, buddy, come on back.
What's your 20? 10, 4.
Right? Because we use 10-4 codes, or at least used to use 10-4 or 10 codes all the time. And it's public knowledge, it's public domain, and ultimately when I use this 10 code, I'm not trying to obscure my message, right? I'm trying to ensure that the distant end can receive and understand my message. That's the purpose of encoding as compared to encryption. All right, encryption is intentionally trying to obscure the message so that a distant end who I don't want to understand what I'm saying cannot and potentially will never understand. So if you're loading a key, you're probably illegal, right? But if you're encoding, and it could be a complex code, right? I could have a master keypad. Boom, there's one right there. And it looks like it kind of makes sense, right? I have a series of columns and rows, and in order to say a word, I can use a series of numbers. And in this case, you know, this keypad probably is on the verge, but if I happen to have this in public domain, it's accessible to anybody and everybody because it's on my Google Drive, and anybody with a link can go out and get it. So technically, you know, it's public domain knowledge that's out there. Certainly something like this could be utilized in order to be able to communicate effectively within your community, right? I could send a complex message, as we can see here, and we can see how that's going to be coded, and then we can see what it's going to look like after it's in or decoded. So it takes a long, complex message, it shortens it, but ensures that the message cannot be misunderstood. That's why we use encoding, to ensure that the message cannot be misunderstood. Team, just a few principles to put out there for you as you're trying to establish a reliable, effective, secure, and legal comms plan for yourself or your community. Again, man, I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts and your comments down below as we continue to master our craft and develop our tactical virtue. As always, until then, you stay out there, you keep grinding, and you stay stoked.